Today's video is brought to you by our sponsor Card Kingdom, and right now you can pre-order Zendikar Rising by heading over to cardkingdom.com. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Zendikar Rising spoilers. And I know it's a weekend, but we still have some really exciting stuff to talk about, which means we should probably jump into it, start talking about sweet new Zendikar Rising cards. And we kick things off today with another modal double-faced mythic, land, flip and dispel, all those shenanigans. Our blue version, Seagate Restoration / Seagate Reborn. So, like other mythic modal flip cards, one side is a land, come into play untapped for 3 life, adds a blue mana. The other side is 7 mana sorcery, draw cards equal to the number of cards in your hand plus 1. You have no max hand size for the rest of the game. So essentially, a land that can come into play untapped with an expensive but potentially powerful card draw spell. It is a little bit inconsistent. Like, you need cards in hand to make it good. If you only have 1 card in hand, it's going to be, 7 mana, draw 2? That's not super exciting. But at 4 cards in hand, you're drawing 5. If you have 7 cards in hand, you're going all the way up to 15 and no max hand size. So in a control deck where you're always going to have a handful of cards, there is a potentially powerful ability, or even in some sort of ramp style deck, it could be very good as well. So Seagate Restoration, it's sort of like a reverse Recurring Insight. That's the best I could come up with. Recurring Insight, same sort of card draw trigger, minus the +1 aspect, but it targets your opponent, so you can control Seagate Restoration a lot more than you can control Recurring Insight. Recurring Insight does see some commander play, but in 1v1 formats, trusting that your opponent is going to have enough cards in hand to make it worth it, even with a rebound, is very risky. Seagate Restoration, all it cares about is your hand, and you can control how much card draw is in your deck, how many cards are in your hand, at least to some extent, which powers it up. Similarly to other flip cards, I think the big deal is just the low opportunity cost. I imagine this card is specifically designed for control decks, kind of going back across formats. Is a 7 mana, draw cards equal to the cards you're at +1, no max hand side. Is that a card you want to play? Not really. I don't think you'd play that, except for the fact that it comes attached to a land that can come into play untapped. But since it comes into play untapped, potentially on a land, I think this card has potential kind of across formats. I'm not saying it's going to be an all-star or a 4 of in every deck, but I think in any sort of standard blue-white control deck, I do think this is a 4 of, that you just play every single time, and it's really, really good. I think the same is true moving back to Teferi Hero of Dominaria control decks in Pioneer and Historic, going back to Modern Teferi Time Raveler blue-white control. Maybe even a copy could show up in some sort of Legacy Miracle style deck, but I think it does get a little less powerful the further back you go and the faster your formats get. But I do think this is an easy control inclusion in formats, definitely standard, Historic, Pioneer, probably a little bit in Modern, maybe a chance in Legacy as well. So again, I'm kind of running out of stuff to say about these cards. The front half, the spell half, is a little bit overcosted. It is not a card that you would play as a non-land card in your deck. On the other hand, it comes attached to a land, so the opportunity cost is really low. Any value you can get out of your lands is really good. So because of that, I think this card is going to see a ton of play, not as appealing in aggressive decks. If you're playing an aggressive deck, I think it loses a lot of its appeal. But in blue-white control style decks, Simic Ramp style decks, I think Seagate Reborn going to be a very, very strong card in an easy inclusion in several different formats. Next on our list, we have Fathworld Sculptor, along with a really sweet promo art, and I think this card is actually very, very strong. I've actually been surprised. I heard some people saying they think this card isn't very good. I think this card is incredibly strong. So Fathworld Sculptor, 6 mana, Gruul color, legendary elemental. You get a 5/5 that when it enters the battlefield, you get a 0/1 green plant creature token for each basic land you control. And then landfall, when a land comes into play under your control, you put 4 +1/+1 counters on target plant you control. So comes into play, make some plans. Lands come into play, grow those plants. This makes it very similar to Avenger of Zendikar. I would say this is probably a fixed Avenger of Zendikar. Avenger of Zendikar counts total lands, so it hits on non-basics, which is a big deal. On the other hand, I don't think hitting just on basic lands makes Paleth a bad card. When you think about what this card really is, just bear with me and let's dig into this card. Let's say when you cast Paleth, maybe you have 3 basic lands on the battlefield. So you're getting a 5/5 for 6 and then 3/0/1 plants. The big deal simple as whenever a land comes into play, you're putting 4 counters on a plant. So if you can play this and have a land drop left over, you immediately make one of those plants into a 4/5. So a 6 drop that makes 4 bodies, growing one of those bodies into a 4/5, with it being a 5/5, that's already really good. But if that land's a fetch land, you can make 2 of those plants into 4/5s, or 1 into an 8/9 to come along with your 5/5. So I don't think you have to go super wide like you do with Avenger of Zendikar. Avenger of Zendikar, because it pumps +1/+1 for each plant when a land comes into play, it really incentivizes you to try to make as many plants as possible, because the more plants you have on the battlefield, the more power that +1/+1 counter ability is going to give you. Paleth is like a go tall version of Avenger of Zendikar. You don't need to make 20 plants with it, 10 plants with it to be good. You just need to make 2 or 3 plants with it, which is pretty easy. Like, most decks are going to have some number of basic lands, even more in ramp decks that are playing ramp spells that get basic lands. And then every land is adding a ridiculous amount of power to the battlefield because of how the landfall trigger works. So I think this card is a really good ramp card, a really good commander card. I mean, if you look at Standard, what's one thing Standard's really good at? Putting lands into play. We got Cultivates and Migration Pass and Uros. It's not that hard to get up to 6 mana for Falith. And then you also have access to all these ramp spells, which turn into pump spells, putting a bunch of counters on your plants. And we even have some fetch lands in Standard. Well, a fetch land, Fabled Passage, to double up the triggers. Same in Commander and older formats. You have tons of fetch lands to really spiral the +1/+1 counters out of control. Of course, the elementals are rotating. It is, well, was a relative creature type for Standard, but I don't think that really matters. It would be sweet along with like Omnath and Risen Reef, both of which give you additional benefits for lands coming into play. So I could see Paleth being great in that deck. Of course, they're not in Standard, but maybe some sort of historic or even Pioneer elemental decks could take advantage of the ramp of Risen Reef, getting to Paleth, putting a bunch of lands into play, making huge plants and winning the game. And I think this is a really good commander card. Like, I think people are just all around sleeping on this card. Yes, it's not Avenger of Zendikar. You're not going to play it and make 20 plants and then play a fetch land and put 40 power of +1/+1 counters on those plants or whatever. That's not going to happen with Paleth because of the basic land restriction. The good news is you don't need to do that with Paleth to make it good. You just need 2 or 3 plants, and if you get a bonus, 5 plants, 6 plants, because you're some sort of cultivate ramp deck, that's even better. And then every land you come into play is going to grow those plants really, really quickly. So yes, I think in general, it is a worse version of Avenger of Zendikar, but Avenger of Zendikar is really strong. This gets a mana discount, and even being a worse Avenger of Zendikar, it is a really strong card, and it's an Avenger of Zendikar that you can play as your commander, which is pretty cute too, so you can build like Avenger of Zendikar Tribal if you want to in the commander format. We also got, this card, Morag, Fury of Arkum, and oh my goodness, this is one of the weirder cards we've seen in a while. 6 mana, 6/6, legendary Minotaur warrior. Each creature you control gets +1/+1 for each time that it attacks this turn. Which, when you read that, you're like, wait, what does that even do? Like, you only attack once. However, as a landfall ability that says, whenever a land enters a battlefield under your control, if it's your main phase, there's an additional combat phase after this phase. At the beginning of combat, untap all creatures you control. So, the idea is you play this card, and you make a bunch of land drops. Those land drops will give you a bunch of extra combat steps, and then, as you're going through these extra combat steps, every time you're attacking, it's growing all your creatures, so you're going to pour out a ton of damage and win the game. The way Morag is worded is very, very weird, and I believe the intention is to make it a little harder to go infinite with Morag. So let's say it was just like, whenever land comes into play, you get an extra combat step. That would make it really, really easy to go infinite with like Uro in Standard. I guess Uro, you still got to keep drawing lands, but you're just like, Morag, attack, Uro, put a land into play, get an extra combat, do it again. Because it's worded that you have to do this in your main phase, it does restrict some of these combos. It's still possible to combo off with Morag, but it is a little bit harder. In Commander, Sword of the Animus would just go infinite with Morag. You just equip it, attack, put a land into play, extra combat, equip it, attack, put a land into play, extra combat, getting all the lands out of your deck, getting a ton of combat steps. So Morag is worded in a seemingly awkward way to make it fairer, although it's certainly not fair. You can still play Morag and like play a fetch land, crack a fetch land, play a cultivate, play a whatever, migrations path, play a Kadama's Reach, get 4 or 5 land drops, get 4 or 5 combat steps, go attack you and win the game. So you can't combo super easily, but what can you do with Morag? And number one is just things that put a bunch of lands into play. Kadama's Reaches, Bondless Round, Scape Shifts, From the Ashes, ways to sack all your lands, get a bunch of new lands, just mass ramp spells. These cards are going to be insane because you can stack up a ton of extra combat steps and then probably just win the game, not just from a bunch of combat steps, but also growing your team as you attack in those combat steps. So that is probably the easiest way. Some sort of just like land-based ramp deck. You can go like truly infinite if you want to put some work into it. You need something like Retreat to Coral Helm to untap a creature whenever a land comes into play. Something like Walking Atlas, which taps to put a land into play. And then you have like Is It Boilerworks, a bounce land that can keep bouncing itself. So you just like Walking Atlas, put Is It Boilerworks into play. Is It Boilerworks triggers, that's going to bounce itself back to your hand. Retreat to Coral Helm triggers, that can untap your Walking Atlas, so then you do it again. That will give you infinite combat steps. So there are ways to go infinite. It's just a little bit harder than like, oh, put a Sword of Animist on it, and now I go infinite and win the game. So I appreciate Wizards making it a little bit harder. I think one of the restrictions of this card is it is mono red. So if you're going to play this as your commander, you don't get a lot of those awesome ramp spells we were talking about. You don't get some of those easy combos we were just talking about because they're in the wrong colors in commander. You do get Bird Ishtar, you can't play fetch lands, but it is a little bit restricted by its color, which might mean it's better as a 99 card. I could definitely imagine Morag being like insane in Lord Windgrace, being able to put lands onto the battlefield. Insane in Sethron Minotaurs is another powerful Minotaur in the 99. Maybe some sort of Omnath landfall style deck. Those strategies can easily take advantage of Morag. And then the other place I'm excited for this is another piece of the puzzle for the Deathbellow Warcry deck with Minotaurs. For the Deathbellow Warcry Minotaur deck, we've played it in Pioneer, we've played it in Historic. It's always better than it looks, but Morag seems absolutely insane, especially if you can hold back a land drop. You Deathbellow Warcry, you get like Sethron, Morag, Krogba Warcaller, Rageblood Shaman, have a ton of hasty Minotaurs, make a land drop, get some extra combat steps, go attacking, win the game on the spot. So I think Morag, it's a really powerful card. Whether or not it'll be good enough for Standard remains to be seen. I'm not actually sure. It is 6 mana, so that is a bit of a drawback. It can kind of do something right away, but only if you wait to have a land drop available on the turn that you play it. You can get the extra combat step right away. But obviously, if you untap with this in a deck that's built around it, it's going to be insane. And I do think this will be an extremely popular commander card. I think people will play it as their commander, but I actually think it's most exciting as a member of the 99 in landfall style decks, ramp style decks, where Morag is going to just be an absurd finisher. Next on our list, sticky in the world of red cards, we have Cargon Intimidator, a really powerful, aggressive red 2-drop. So 2 mana, you get a 3/1 human warrior with a static ability that says cowards can't block warriors, and you can pay a mana to choose one option that hasn't been chosen yet this turn. Give it +1/+1, so you can make it into a 4/2. You can give a warrior, which it is itself, or it could be another warrior, trample, or you can make a creature into a coward to end a turn. So essentially for 1 mana, you can pump it, you can give it evasion, or you can make one of your opponent's creatures not block by turning it into a warrior. So Cargon Intimidator, when you read this, it reads kind of like a meme because of the cowards can't block warriors decks. Like Juari Intimidator, way back in Future Sight, was the first time we saw this meme-ish text. It has been kind of like a running joke in the community, but this card is definitely not a meme. This is a extremely playable, very strong card. So just so it's good, you don't have to like turn everything into cowards, and you don't have to have a deck full of warriors. This is just a really good standalone red 2-drop. Look at some of the red 2-drops that have seen play recently that kind of compare with the ability to make things not block until end of turn. On-Crop Crasher is a staple, still occasionally shows up in formats like Pioneer. Fire Fist Striker, Earthshaker Kendra were both very good at their standard formats. There are upsides and downsides for Cargon Intimidator, with the biggest downside being you do have to pay a mana to make it so a creature can't block. But even with that drawback, the fact that it can become a 4/2 for 2, which is very strong, the fact that it can trample things up to get in that Alpha Strike and win the game, means I don't think you have to like build around this card. I think this is just as a red 2-drop standalone threat in a mono red aggro, Gruul aggro style deck. I think this is just a good playable card on its own. Of course, you can build around it and be like Warrior Tribal and do some janky stuff like that, but you don't need to do that. It's just a good card on right, and Warriors are improving slightly. Like, I still don't think we have enough to make Warrior Tribal a thing, but with Cargon Intimidator, we also have like the new Nahiri cares about Warriors, Winota, Alpine Houndmaster, and if you do have additional Warriors, it definitely powers up that ability to turn things into cowards, because that's not just going to make Cargon Intimidator unable to be blocked by a creature, it's going to make more of your creatures unblockable as well. So Cargon Intimidator, it's just a good red 2-drop. It's got good stats, it's got good abilities. I think this is what will definitely see play at aggro decks in Standard. We also got Magmatic Channeler, and this card's really sweet. 2 mana, another red 2-drop, all the red 2-drops today. Very different than our last card, though. 2 mana, 1/3, Human Wizard. As long as there are 4 or more instances of sorcery cards in your graveyard, it gets +3/+1, so it becomes a 4/4 for 2, and you can tap it to discard a card, exile the top 2 cards of your library, you can pick one and play that card until end of turn. So Magmatic Channeler, essentially like super rummaging. You discard a card, but you get to pick one of your top 2 cards to be the card you cast, and it's gonna grow big. The thing it reminds me of most, as weird as this sounds, is probably Grimflayer, is a 2-drop that starts off kind of underpowered, but grows into a 4/4 based on the number of cards in your graveyard. And Grimflayer still sees play in older formats to some extent, and it was very good in Standard, so that's already a vote of confidence for Magmatic Channeler. As far as Standard is concerned, we do have some wizards that you can take advantage of this with. Rael is probably the best of the bunch, where you're able to use Magmatic Channeler to stock your graveyard, and Rael's going to want you drawing and discarding cards anyway, so you're quickly going to grow it into a 4/4 for 2, and then you have this decent threat, decent blocker, and this card advantage engine. Plus there's other stuff, Kaza, Umra, Mystic, and you could also play this in just a Spellslinger style deck. Instead of focusing on the creature type, you can just play it along with like Sprite Dragon, Stormwing Entity. These are decks that are playing a bunch of cheap spells to turn on Magmatic Channeler, and then you're going to have that 4/4, and then if you run out of action, you can use Magmatic Channeler to dig for more. However, I think I'm actually more excited for this card in older formats. Why? I think it's a fine Standard card, and it probably will see Standard play. In older formats, this seems like it could be a good inclusion for some prowess-style decks that are already just overloaded on cheap spells. If you're playing all these like Gut Shots and Lava Darts and Manamorphoses, you're going to turn this into a 4/4 really quickly, and a 4/4 for 2, even in older formats, is still a good rate, and you have a relevant ability attached, so it's just super easy. Once you get back to formats like Modern in specific, where you Thought Scour and Free Spell, this is going to be a 4/4 really, really quickly. It goes along with any sort of Spellslinger graveyard style deck, so I think Magmatic Channeler got Standard potential for sure, but maybe even better in older formats where you can turn this into a 4/4 really quickly and have a good body that also has a relevant activated ability that you could use each and every turn to generate card advantage. We also got another 2-drop. It's 2-drop day in Zendikar Rising spoiler lads. Lubinarcus Pirate. So Lubinarcus Pirate, 2 mana, 1/1 white creature, human cleric. At the beginning of combat on your turn, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. And I'm going to say, while I've been high on the last 2-drops, I think this one's pretty bad. Like, it's just very slow. It starts off underpowered. So you play this, you have to put the counter on it just to get a Grizzly Bear out of the deal. So it starts out underpowered. Yes, it does potentially grow turn by turn. It just goes really slowly, potentially too slowly to actually be constructed playable. So I think this is mostly like a limited card. If it goes unchecked, stays out for a bunch of turns, it can't take over the game. As far as Standard is concerned, if there is any chance of it showing up, it's probably some sort of green-white counter stack. We do have like some pieces for that. Conclave Mentor, Basri Cat, Basri's Lieutenant. So maybe there's some counter-themed deck that could take advantage of it. But even there, I'm not 100% sure that it's fast enough to be relevant, even if the theme of your deck is adding +1/+1 counters to your creatures. So I'm going to say, I think Lubinarcus Pirate is just essentially unplayable and constructed. Probably a fine addition to your limited deck, but just too slow to really do anything in 60-card formats. We also got another uncommon modal flip card, double face card, Juari Disruption. So this one, backside, tap land, adds a blue mana. Front side, 2 mana, counter target spell unless its controller pays 1. This is essentially Censor. So Censor might not sound like much, but that's a card that sees a ton of play in Historic. It sees some play in Pioneer. Doesn't really see much Modern play. Saw a lot of play in Standard as well. When you read Censor is same exact ability, except rather than being able to play it for a land, you can cycle it in hopes of finding a land. So what is better? And I think the answer is, it's really tough to say. In the early game, I think Juari Disruption is just straight up better than Censor, because the value of Censor is you can have it in the early game to counter something, but maybe you're desperate to like hit a land drop and you kept a landlight hand. You can cycle it to try to find your land drops. Juari Disruption's got that covered. You got the counter on turn 2. You also have a land if you need it. So it does everything Censor does, except you never have to spend mana to cycle it. On the other hand, in the late game, Censor does have more additional value, because in the late game, a counter something unless your opponent plays 1 spell is just not very effective. Your opponent can probably pay the 1, and in the late game, you probably don't want to draw an extra land. So in the late game, Censor can draw you a new card, rather than drawing you a land or a bad counter spell. So how do you weigh this out? I'm not exactly sure, but I do think this will see a lot of play in Standard, and I do think it has a shot to show up in formats like Pioneer, in formats like Historic as well. We also got the worst Uro of all time, Scale of the Heights. So Scale of the Heights, basically like Uro and Growth Spiral, 3 mana sorcery, put a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 creature, you can gain 2 life, and you can put an extra land into play this turn, and you draw a card. So it's essentially like a mini Uro trigger. You're very close to getting Uro's trigger, except it's not a sorcery, rather than a 6/6 body that's also going to give you that trigger when it attacks. We've seen Growth Spiral be incredibly busted. We've seen Uro be incredibly busted. Is Scale of the Heights going to be good enough to see play? I would say no if I hadn't been playing Magic for the past year, but after seeing how insane Growth Spiral and Uro is, maybe Scale of the Heights, as bad as it looks compared to those cards, maybe it's still good enough. So I wouldn't completely write it off. It's obviously way, way worse than these other options, but those other options have been so overpowered, they're like getting banned in formats and being the best cards in various formats. So maybe even a power down version, to the extent that Scale of Heights is powered down, which is a very large extent, that still might be good enough. Like, that's how good these cards have been. Finally today, we got our parade of lower rarity cards, mostly stuff for limited, Pauper, maybe. There are a couple, want to mention super quickly. Iridescent Hornbeetle, it's really fun. Being your end step, create a 1/1 insect for each +1/+1 counter you put out a creature this turn. So in theory, this can make a ton of insects, which is really sweet. However, as a 5 mana 3/4, I don't think it's actually competitive enough to see play. Maybe like +1/+1 counter themed commander decks could do some shenanigans with it. The other card I think is interesting of this bunch is Cinderclasm, which is kind of like a Electrickery style effect. 2 mana for 1 damage to each creature, or 3 mana with the kicker for 2 damage to each creature at instant speed. So kind of like a bad Pyroclasm, but the instant speed aspect does offer some appeal. The other card that's really weird on this list is Lithoform Blight. I'm not really sure the purpose of this card. 2 mana enchantment, comes into play, draw a card, you enchant a land, and that land loses all types and abilities and has tap for a colorless or pay 1 life, tap to add 1 mana of any color. So kind of like a Spreading Seas, but it doesn't have the mana screw potential of Spreading Seas. I guess you could use it to turn off Tron lands, for example, if you're looking for hate lands for something like Tron, other lands with activated abilities, Amirias and so forth, but still just a really weird card because it loses that mana screw potential that we've seen with powerful options like Spreading Seas. Anyway, I believe that brings us to the end of our daily Zendikar Rising spoilers for today. So let me know what you think. How good is Seagate Restoration, our blue mythic double-faced modal card? Where's that going to show up? Can it break outside of Standard? Can it show up in control decks, other styles of decks? What about Fathworld Sculptor? Is that just a bad Avenger of Zendikar, or did I convince you that it's actually a pretty insane card, even though it's not as good as Avenger of Zendikar? What about Morag Fury of Akum, our extra combat step mythic Minotaur? How many extra combat steps can you take? What kind of shenanigans can you pull off with that card in Standard, in Commander? What about all the 2-drops? Cargon Intimidator, Cowards Not Blocking Warriors, the Wizard Magmatic Channeler, the 4/4 for 2 potentially if you can sling enough spells. How about the white one, Lubinarcus Pirate, putting a +1/+1 counter on things? All the lower rarity stuff, let me know in the comments. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, help us out by clicking that like button down below. And to keep up on all the latest and greatest, click that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit that bell icon to get alerts whenever we have new videos. And if you want to, check out some of our other sweet videos here and here.